They told us West Africa couldn't survive without ECOWAS. They told us the Sahel would collapse without French troops, IMF loans, and Western stability missions. For decades, they sold us the lie that independence was impossible. But today, that lie just died. In the dead silence of global headlines, something happened that Paris, Washington, and every puppet in ECOWAS prayed would never occur. The Alliance of Sahel States, AES, did the unthinkable. They didn't just break the chains. They melted them. Before we go deeper, hit that like button and subscribe if you believe Africa deserves to own its destiny. Because what I'm about to reveal is the information they don't want you to hear. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have just transformed the Liptaco-Gourma Authority from a forgotten relic into a powerful AES implementation agency. And make no mistake, this is not a name change. This is an act of war against dependency. Why? Because this single decision cuts the strings that kept the Sahel dancing to a colonial tune. For the first time, the AES bloc is building infrastructure, securing borders, and funding development without ECOWAS oversight, without IMF signatures, and without French vetoes. The West thought they could predict every move. They were wrong. What AES just did could destroy the illusion of ECOWAS power forever. And if they succeed, Africa will never look the same. Here's the real question: why risk everything to make this move? What pushed these nations to flip the entire system on its head? The answer lies in a truth so raw, so buried, that most Africans never see it on the news. Stay with me, because once you understand the broken game AES walked away from, you'll never look at ECOWAS the same way again. To understand why this AES move is a revolution, you need to know the system they just walked away from. A system so carefully crafted that most Africans still believe it was built for their benefit. That system is called ECOWAS. On paper, ECOWAS was supposed to be the dream of regional integration, open borders, economic cooperation, peace, and stability. But peel back the layers, and what you see is not unity. It's a control mechanism designed to keep West Africa chained to foreign masters. Ask yourself, who funds ECOWAS? Who dictates its policies? Who enforces its sanctions? It's not Africans in Bamako or Niamey, it's Paris, it's Brussels, it's Washington. And through ECOWAS, Western powers have perfected the art of economic colonization in a pan-African mask. Here's how the trap works. Step 1. Debt chains. When African nations need cash, the World Bank and IMF step in with loans. Sounds helpful, right? Wrong. Those loans come with structural adjustment programs that force governments to privatize state assets, slash subsidies, and open markets to foreign corporations. The result: African economies become pipelines for Western profit while citizens drown in poverty. Step 2. Sanctions and isolation. If a leader dares to resist, ECOWAS becomes the enforcer. Remember Mali in 2021, Niger in 2023. The moment they challenged French dominance and foreign military bases, ECOWAS didn't negotiate, it punished them. Borders closed, trade blocked, banking frozen. Ordinary Africans starved as a warning to anyone else dreaming of sovereignty. Step 3. Military puppetry. While African leaders debate, French and American troops stay stationed across the Sahel under security partnerships. But who are they really protecting? Not our villagers, not our farmers. They protect foreign mining companies extracting gold, uranium, and oil. Resources that should build African wealth, but instead power Western economies. And then there's the currency stranglehold, the CFA franc. A colonial relic that forces African nations to keep their reserves in French banks, handing Paris the power to manipulate their economies at will. Even today, ECOWAS was pushing the ECO currency, another French-backed scheme disguised as African integration. This is the reality AES faced, a system that looked African on the outside but reeked of colonial control on the inside. A system where sovereignty was a slogan, not a fact. So when Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger tore up their ECOWAS membership, it wasn't impulsive, it was survival. They were done being punished for wanting independence. They were done watching their people for decisions made in European boardrooms. But here's the twist: walking away from ECOWAS was just the first blow. What AES did next, the transformation of the Liptaco-Gourma Authority, wasn't just rebellion. It was a blueprint for African self-determination in real time. When Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger walked out of ECOWAS, the world called it reckless. Western analysts predicted economic collapse. Headlines screamed, "Isolation will destroy them!" They wanted us to believe that without ECOWAS, and by extension, without Western approval, the Sahel would crumble into dust. But what happened next shattered that narrative. The AES bloc didn't collapse. They constructed. They didn't beg. They built. And the boldest step yet came with a single, calculated stroke, transforming the Liptaco-Gourma Authority into their official implementation agency. Now pause for a second and let that sink in. This was not an empty gesture. This was a masterstroke of strategy, a blueprint that flips the colonial script upside down. The Liptaco-Gourma Authority was born in 1970 as a regional development body, covering parts of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, a zone rich in gold, uranium, oil, and agricultural potential. But for decades, it sat dormant, strangled by underfunding, bureaucratic red tape, and dependency on donor nations. In other words, it was a sleeping giant. And now, AES has awakened that giant by converting it into an AES-controlled implementation agency. The bloc has created a sovereign engine for development, a command center to plan, fund, and execute projects across the Sahel without ECOWAS oversight and without foreign intermediaries. That means no IMF preconditions, no World Bank vetoes, no begging Paris for clearance. What will this agency do? Everything ECOWAS promised but never delivered. It will build cross-border infrastructure, roads, energy grids and dams, designed for Africans, not for French mining companies. It will coordinate agriculture projects to feed Sahelian populations, instead of forcing them to depend on imported grain from Europe. It will channel local resources, gold, uranium, oil, into domestic development instead of letting them vanish into Western stock markets. And here's what makes it revolutionary: AES is funding this through domestic capital mobilization and alliances with non-Western partners. That's right. While ECOWAS kneels for French aid, AES is cutting deals with countries that respect sovereignty. This is Pan-African ideology translated into action. It's not just speeches and slogans, it's governance with teeth. And that's why the West is terrified. Because if 3 nations can do this, what happens when 5 join? 20. Think about it. For decades, we were told Africa cannot integrate without Western expertise. But here is integration happening on African soil, under African control, with African priorities at the center. AES is proving a simple truth the world didn't want us to believing: Africa does not need permission to rise. But don't think this came without risk. By making this move, AES has declared open defiance against the colonial economy, and the empire never retreats quietly. So brace yourself, because what's coming next will reveal just how far the West is willing to go to crush this dream. When AES announced this transformation, the headlines barely whispered it, but behind closed doors in Paris, Washington, and Brussels, alarms went off. Why? Because what happened in the Sahel wasn't just a local policy change. It was a rupture in the global system of control. For decades, Western powers built a fortress of influence around West Africa. They controlled its currencies, dictated its trade, policed its security, and even shaped its leadership through covert operations. Every African institution, from ECOWAS to so-called peacekeeping forces, operated like a puppet theater with invisible strings tied to European banks and foreign ministries. And then AES came along and cut the strings. That's why the backlash was inevitable. Already, Western think tanks are calling AES leaders rogue regimes. Media narratives are shifting to paint these nations as unstable, dangerous, and unfit to govern. The propaganda machine is in full swing, because perception is the first battlefield. If they can convince Africans that AES is chaos, then resistance collapses from within. But make no mistake, it won't stop at words. History tells us what comes next. When Patrice Lumumba demanded real independence, he didn't live to see the year end. When Thomas Sankara stood up to imperialism, they silenced him with bullets. When Muammar Gaddafi proposed a gold-backed African currency, NATO bombed his country into dust. So ask yourself, do you think AES will walk this road without enemies lurking in the shadows? Do you think the same forces that murdered Sankara and destroyed Libya will allow Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger to dismantle the colonial economy? Expect economic warfare, sanctions that strangle trade, blockades that starve economies, and humanitarian missions hiding foreign interference. Expect sabotage, funding internal uprisings, arming extremist groups, and destabilizing border regions to create a crisis narrative. And here's the sinister part. They will do it in the name of democracy and human rights. They always do. They will claim AES is a threat to regional stability, while the real threat is Africa breaking free from their grip. Yet, amid this storm, something extraordinary is happening. Instead of collapsing under pressure, the AES alliance is doubling down. They are coordinating military defense, strengthening internal markets, and forging partnerships outside Western control. Partners who don't demand obedience in exchange for cooperation. This is why the backlash will intensify. Because if AES survives, it becomes a living example for the rest of Africa. A message that sovereignty is not a fantasy. It's possible, and that possibility terrifies the empire more than any bullet, any bomb, any speech at the UN. But here's the twist. What the West expects to be the AES downfall might just become its greatest triumph. Because in this struggle, every sanction, every smear, every covert strike only fuels one truth, that Africa has nothing left to lose but its chains. The empire thought AES would collapse under pressure. They expected starving populations, crumbling economies, and citizens begging for a return to ECOWAS rule. But the opposite is unfolding, and it's rewriting the story of African resistance in real time. Instead of retreating, the AES bloc is advancing. The transformation of the Liptaco-Gourma Authority is no longer just an announcement. It's becoming a machine of execution. Projects once trapped in red tape are moving forward with African control at the core. And for the first time in decades, these nations are proving something the West hoped: we'd never believe independence works. Look at what's happening across the Sahel. Borders that were once lawless corridors for smugglers and terrorists are now under coordinated AES security frameworks. Instead of relying on foreign troops, AES forces are conducting joint patrols, sharing intelligence, and reclaiming sovereignty over their own land. The message is clear. The age of outsourcing security to Paris is over. Infrastructure, long neglected under ECOWAS dependency, is back on the agenda. Roads connecting Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are being mapped and funded without IMF signatures. AES is prioritizing energy interconnectivity to power homes and industries without the bottlenecks of donor agencies. For decades, Africans were told to wait for development. Wait for loans, wait for investors, wait for blessings from Europe. That wait is over. And the economic strategy, it's equally bold. AES leaders are tapping domestic resources to fund their programs. Gold revenues, agricultural surpluses, and local capital mobilization. They are exploring partnerships with states outside the Western orbit, forming a South-South cooperation network where sovereignty is the currency, not submission. China, Russia, and even other African nations are stepping in. Not as masters, but as strategic partners. The results are not just policy. They're psychological. In Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey, the mood has shifted from despair to defiance. Crowds rally in the streets, waving AES flags, chanting slogans of unity and liberation. Citizens who once saw ECOWAS as the guardian of stability now view it as the warden of a colonial prison. This turnaround isn't just political. It's ideological. It's tearing down the myth that Africa cannot stand without Western crutches. For too long, our history has been narrated as tragedy. Slavery, colonization, debt traps. Today, AES is writing a new chapter, and it reads like a warning to every empire. Africa is no longer your experiment. Africa is your equal. But let's be clear, the struggle isn't over. The backlash is still in motion. The sabotage is still coming. Yet every attempt to break AES only strengthens its resolve, because the Sahel has discovered the one weapon the West cannot crush: a united will. And that brings us to the question every African must answer: will we watch this revolution from the sidelines, or will we join it? The question now is simple yet seismic. If 3 nations in the Sahel, written off as failed states by Western analysts, can tear down the colonial script and build their own future, what excuse does the rest of Africa have? This is more than a political shift, it's a spiritual awakening. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have proven that sovereignty isn't a dream locked in the speeches of our ancestors. It's a living choice, one that demands courage, sacrifice, and an unbreakable will. They faced sanctions, isolation, and threats of invasion, and still, they chose freedom. So what about the rest of us? How long will Africa keep outsourcing its destiny to foreign banks, foreign troops, and foreign think tanks? How long will we swallow the lie that we need Western aid, when that aid is nothing but a leash around our necks? Look around you. While AES is building roads across the Sahel, how many nations are still waiting for IMF signatures to fix a single bridge? While AES secures its borders with African soldiers, how many countries are still hosting foreign bases that dictate their security policies? While AES taps local resources to fund local projects, how many leaders are still flying to Paris, Washington, or London with begging bowls? This is not a moment for applause. It's a moment for alignment. Because what AES is doing is bigger than the Sahel. It's a signal to every African nation, every Afro-descendant in the diaspora, every young mind scrolling through history books in search of pride. The chains can break. The system can fall. But only if we choose to fight. And this fight isn't just in the corridors of power. It's in your mind, your voice, your actions. Do you accept a future where Africa remains a resource colony, or do you demand a future where Africa owns its destiny? Do you believe sovereignty is a slogan, or do you believe it is our birthright? Here's the uncomfortable truth: AES can't win this battle alone. If the rest of Africa stays silent, the empire will crush them, just like they crushed Lumumba, Sankara, and Gaddafi. But if we unite, if we reject dependency, if we reclaim control of our resources, our economies, our politics, then the AES rebellion becomes a continental revolution. So, I'm asking you, should other nations abandon ECOWAS and join the AES alliance? Is this the blueprint for real independence? And most importantly, what will you do to spread this message? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this video if you believe Africa deserves freedom. And subscribe to our channel, because we are not here to entertain. We are here to liberate minds. History is unfolding before our eyes. The question is, will you be a spectator or a soldier in the war for Africa's future?